I'm pleased to introduce Jillian Leigh Gross, who I met at the recent community college, the Council for the Study of Community College meetings, and she agreed to present to you all a guest lecture based on the presentation that she gave at the conference. And at the conference, she wasn't able to include some of the examples due to time, and I thought it would be really great if she would have the opportunity to share all of her work. And it fits perfectly with our current conversations about internationalization, international branch campuses, and the expansion of different higher education models around the world. So I will move on to let Jillian explain her work to you.
Hi, I'm Jillian Leigh Gross, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Michigan, and my research focuses on community colleges, and in particular, the expansion of community colleges in emerging economies. So, internationalization has absolutely become a buzzword, and over the years, since 1979, in fact, 4 issues of the New Directions for Community College voted to this topic. Most recently, a really great issue last year, and they're planning another one right now. So with this increase in interest in internationalization, there's also a desire to understand, to come up with a comprehensive framework for understanding how community colleges are engaging in this work at the organizational level, but also sort of more globally. And so the Community Colleges for International Development and Institute for International Education have 2 frameworks in particular that have been really, really useful. But as I was reading, I realized that I'm personally really interested in learning about the activities in which community colleges are engaging overseas, rather than the work that they're doing domestically on their own campuses, and then finding a way to analyze this activity not only at the organizational level, but at the country level. So given the dearth of empirical research on these topics, this presentation today is my attempt to develop a framework to begin addressing this gap. So what we're going to talk about today is we're just going to briefly go over what it means to be a community college in America, and talk about 2 major influences, including globalization and internationalization right now. And then we're going to talk about how American community colleges have responded to the force of globalization and the pressure to internationalize. And I argue that this response can be explained in using a framework of 4 waves of global expansion. And then we'll also talk about intended outcomes, precipitating factors. I'll go into some depth about the case of India, which is where my personal research interest lies. And then obviously we'll talk a little bit about limitations and potential future research. So, the defining characteristics of the American Community College, and I want to point out that we really are talking about the American Community College as opposed to many of the global counterparts that are doing similar work in other countries. And many of these defining characteristics really are transnationally relevant, but I'm specifically talking about American community colleges starting in the early 20th century with the boom years after World War II. And the 4 curricular missions for which community colleges are generally held responsible are traditional academic education, career and technical education, although the lines between those 2 are quite blurry these days. Community education, which includes all the non-credit leisure activities, as well as a lot of workforce and economic development activities. And then developmental education, which provides an opportunity for students of all ages and backgrounds to get the skills necessary to engage in college-level work. And then intertwined with those curricular missions are these social commitments. And these are the foundations upon which the work of community colleges are built. And as we'll talk about, community responsiveness has changed. The definition of community responsiveness has really changed over the years as the boundaries of the community in which community colleges work has has really grown and in many ways has gone beyond geographic boundaries when you think about both online education as well as interaction with the global economy. Open access is a pretty obvious one, where community colleges were designed to give everyone a chance to higher education. So really that move from elite to mass and now universal education. Social and economic development are ideas that the community college should provide both the ability for mobility socially as well as economically, and economic growth in the community as well. And then horizontal and vertical mobility refers to the idea of a lot of opportunity offered by the community college. So vertical mobility is the idea of providing access and opportunities to transition smoothly from high school to college and to college into upper level degrees, and enter and exit as necessary. And then horizontal mobility is really about moving in and out of the workforce and education as well. And these are all intertwined and interdependent characteristics of the American community college. So globalization. I'm not going to say a ton of stuff about globalization because lots of scholars before me have written plenty and do a much better job than I ever could do. But I will point out that the conditions of globalization, such as privatization, decentralization, technological advances, and multiculturalism, are really redefined the interaction of socio-cultural systems like education, the state, the professions, and the economy. And one consequence of globalization, or of your positive or negative feelings about the phenomenon, is that community in community college was redefined in a way that attends to both local and now global economic, knowledge, political, and humanitarian concerns. In essence, it positions the community college beyond the borders of its geographic boundaries and really places it in a much larger world system. While globalization is often defined as the condition or environmental context within which colleges and the higher education system operates, Knight defines internationalization as the response to that condition. And in this context, it's really about what community colleges are doing to respond to globalization. So much of this effort is taking place domestically on campuses in the U.S. And on the next slide, we'll take a quick look at one framework being used to measure this activity. However, I'm focused on what American community colleges are actually doing overseas as opposed to at home. So I argue that in reading the literature, there are 4 waves of what I'm calling cross-border expansion. And the waves framework is borrowed from a conceptual article by Mazaral, Suter, and Singh regarding the internationalization of colleges and universities. Of course, their research didn't cover community colleges because much of the research on higher education tends to ignore community colleges. The authors take these waves, this framework is drawn from the literature on the firm, and it describes the process wherein organizations actually seek out overseas opportunities and, thinking of this as an export and import process. Under this framework, the first wave is study abroad, and it's considered a direct export of individuals to another country. The second wave of curricular partnerships, or twinning as the literature calls it, describes the process when U.S. community colleges jointly develop a program together in a host country. And this is viewed as forward integration of their activities. It's really about moving organizational activities overseas. And then the third wave is branch campuses, and the cross-border educational research team at SUNY tracks international branch campuses, and they define them, and I'm quoting here, as an entity owned, in part or fully, by a foreign education provider with some face-to-face instruction, with access to an entire academic program that leads to a degree offered by the foreign educational provider. And finally, the fourth wave appears to depart from the literature on the firm, but was readily apparent when reading the literature regarding community college activities overseas. And this is an idea of sustained partnerships for capacity building. And this generally extends beyond simple curricular offerings. And this happens often, but not exclusively, with community college global counterparts like technical colleges, polytechnics, further education colleges, and the whole cadre of community colleges overseas. Before we dive more fully into these waves, let's talk a bit more about internationalization on U.S. campuses. The Community Colleges for International Development Consortium has developed a comprehensive framework that assesses a college's involvement in all of the activities highlighted in these bullet points. And they do so along a continuum of local to global, which is depicted in the bottom bar. As the consortium's name implies, CCID assumes that internationalization is a positive and important endeavor for community colleges, although there remain many critics to these efforts, particularly when considering funding issues that are, generally public funds are declining, although not universally, and costs tend to be rising. So that being said, this framework is particularly useful because it takes a systematic view of internationalization that incorporates efforts from the individual classroom to the leadership team at the college, and that it acknowledges a continuum of responses that must be adapted to the local context of the college. Among the many student-centered activities on U.S. campuses beyond organizational issues, the most broadly pursued are efforts to infuse activities of the college curriculum and co-curriculum with global and multicultural perspectives. And another growing area of internationalization is the recruitment of international students to study on U.S. campuses. However, what I'm interested in are the activities led or organized by community colleges that actually take place in other countries. So returning to the 4 waves framework, the first wave that's outlined is study abroad. And study abroad has been growing in popularity in recent years, particularly among community colleges. Whereas in 2001, only about a third of community colleges reported offering study abroad opportunities for credit. And it's become nearly ubiquitous by a 2006 survey, and so we can imagine that it's only continuing to grow. And for community colleges, study abroad includes faculty exchanges as well. And this has been going on for many years, since probably the 1950s. Community college faculty started doing sojourns abroad. But as Carol Stacks-Brown points out in a recent NAFSA posting, only a small portion of community colleges are really engaging in this type of work beyond study abroad. And I do believe it's important to acknowledge that study abroad is not just for students, that for many years these faculty exchanges have played an important role in internationalization as well. In terms of curricular partnerships, I want to point out that these 4 waves that I talk about are not necessarily a linear progression. There does seem to be a general pattern that colleges will start by creating a study abroad. Then for those few that take their overseas activities to the next level, some colleges are actually partnering with overseas colleges, universities, and community college global counterparts to jointly offer curriculum. There may be joint transcripts, joint course numbering, a sharing of faculty, and like Broward College in Florida calls this an affiliate program, and they've been leaders in these efforts since the 1980s when community colleges began engaging in this work. So of the handful of these overseas institutions that participate in this type of partnership, there seems to be an interest in using this as a stepping stone toward accreditation by a U.S. agency. And this is the case with both Broward and Houston Community College, because you'll see that use that curricular partnership as a jumping off point to develop international branch campuses. And of the few community college branch campuses that meet the cross-border educational research team's definition, it's important to know that many have closed. Japan has a really interesting history with this, and it would be worth doing a little more research on for any of those of you who are interested in this. But currently, Houston Community College is managing 2 such branch campuses, and Broward has recently shifted a number of their affiliate programs in 5 countries into branch campuses. what's really interesting, I know about for sure about Broward and Houston, is that these branch campuses are fully accredited by U.S. accreditors, and that the students who attend, so there's a branch campus from Broward in India for sure, I know, and the students who attend that program are Broward College students without ever leaving India. So they attend the courses, they get the degree, and all that work is done in the host country, end up with a Broward College degree, which is pretty impressive. And this may be an area of great growth for community colleges, especially with online education, but there's really no systematic tracking of this effort, so we're not sure just how many international branch campuses exist among all colleges, and let alone U.S. community colleges. These efforts in general, although sort of seemingly attractive for a lot of different, have been wrought with complications, and so that a more likely endeavor, rather than branch campuses, is the growth of a fourth wave that Mazerul, Suter, and Singh overlooked in their conceptualization. And this is that idea of extended collaborations between U.S. and overseas entities, that it can include individual colleges, states, systems, or even whole countries. And additionally, although outside the scope of this framework, there are numerous consortia and governmental and NGO partnerships that sort of work in the space of this sustained capacity building, or this fourth wave of global expansion. So I think it's important to point out that in the 1980s, and even more recently, these initiatives were largely described as the U.S. imparting wisdom about an ideal educational model for teaching, learning, adaptability, and workforce development. But more recently, or more critical as recently, have begun to acknowledge that there's really a multi-directional flow of learning. And Hagedorn and Mizgani's, in their 2013 article, poignantly, I really appreciate the way they close their article, and they say, I'm going to quote directly, when the proposal to the U.S. Embassy project was originally written, the American authors believed that the establishment of community colleges could greatly alleviate the issues confronting Tunisia. But as the project progresses, as we learn more about the country and its historical, political, economic, financial, and cultural realities, we recognize that while the concepts related to the American community colleges may be instructive, a post-secondary response must be wholly Tunisian and be developed only after a careful needs assessment and market analysis are performed. While the American partners may be eager to assist, they must remain cognizant of power and authority to enact change, to establish new institutions, and to create a strong link between education and the workforce lies with Tunisians. I really appreciate the way that they acknowledge that the U.S. model may provide some solutions or hints towards solutions, but that it really has to be an equitable collaboration, and really has to be that pull from the Tunisians as opposed to the push from the Americans. So, why might a community college get involved in some of this work? Well, the intent of this presentation is to lay out a possible framework for understanding overseas activities of American community colleges. I would absolutely be remiss not to touch on the motivations, precipitating factors, facilitating conditions, and potential challenges that are identified in the literature. So quite consistently, motivations for getting involved in overseas activities are related to academic, sociocultural, political, and economic issues that are described as endeavoring to ensure equitable collaboration, humanitarian, and financial benefits. Some of those precipitating factors, we've talked about this push and the pull, and overseas activity is fostered by both the push and the pull of educational forces that are absolutely influenced by globalization. And a number of the precipitating factors have been regularly identified to support such activity from both domestic and overseas partners. So, facilitating conditions, there are both affordances and barriers in these partnerships. And these are pretty intuitive. You'll read about them anytime you're reading about international education. But before you really think about the outcomes or the expectations for overseas work, they have to be both the affordances and the barriers have to be considered when engaging in overseas partnerships. And I would recommend Treat Hartenstein's 2013 article in New Directions for Community Colleges about overseas partnerships. That for anyone interested more deeply in this topic, because they provide an excellent overview and recommendations for consideration when engaging in partnerships for international development. So, India is my favorite topic. I spent last summer conducting a pilot study for my dissertation regarding community colleges in India, and coupled with the reading on this topic, as I analyze what we know about community college activity in India, there's evidence that all four waves are at work, yet but no one college appears to be engaged in all four waves simultaneously. And I think that's a really important point about the nonlinearity of these waves. So currently, Broward has study abroad exchanges at a branch campus, as well as some capacity building work going on in India. But they recently transitioned from their second wave to the third wave. So I think that's really interesting. And I think also you can see all four waves are happening in India by other colleges. So you can see the importance of analyzing both the work of a single American community college overseas, but also analyzing it at the country level, because you'll get different perspectives about what work is being done depending on which perspective you take. I could absolutely go on forever about India. But encourage any one of you who's interested in learning more to come talk to me about the work that's being done, because right now India is engaged in efforts to build a new community college system that is run by the central government. And for many years, since about the 1990s, they have a system, sort of this organic system of community colleges that were developed starting in southern India. And, currently there are about 350 of those colleges operating. They talk about attached to the U.S. model. But when you're there and you're on the ground, it's a really different perspective of community college from what we think of now today as sort of that universal comprehensive community college. For instance, most colleges in India have less than 100 students. So if you think about what it means to create a curriculum for 100 students versus thousands of students, you can see some of the challenges in translating concepts from country to country and adapting and adopting. And then there's also, and that those colleges so far have all grown up outside of the formal higher education system in India. And there was an effort in 2009. There was an effort in 2009 to try and centralize it through one of their open universities, but due to a number of complications and general sort of lack of oversight, that system was shut down. But in 2012, the Ministry of Human Resource Development decided to start another system, and that's right in its infancy right now. So that's just being developed, and you see all four of these waves at play as this new system is developing. So there are community colleges in the United States that are working to develop study abroad programs, some of this curricular twinning. Currently, legislation in India sort of prohibits actual physical branch campuses, but when you look at the definition that Siebert gives you about branch campus, you can see that Broward College actually has one, and I'm interested in more about what's happening there. And then the Indian government is absolutely invested in this capacity, these fourth wave efforts around capacity building, and they're choosing to fund these efforts for U.S. community colleges, as well as community college global counterparts, so Canadian, United Kingdom, and Australia are also getting involved in this new centralized community college system that's being developed in India. So a couple of the limitations. There's some pretty obvious limitations to this conceptualization of 4 waves of global expansion that I outline here. But really, one glaring limitation is that using this framework to analyze U.S. community college activity at the country level can be incredibly difficult because, for instance, in India, there are thousands of colleges that each could create a college-to-college partnership, and there's no systematic way to collect this data. I know that the American Association of Community Colleges is engaged in developing a form for this, but is not yet developed, and that's only one country. But you think about the size and the scale of India as well. It's got 1.2 billion people, and the youngest population in the world. The idea of tracking all of these disparate efforts is pretty incredible. So I would say that this needs to be empirically tested, and we need to explore similar processes in and between countries other than the U.S., and then look at how this makes sense with the bigger picture of internationalization efforts at community colleges. But I think this is really important work, and I think we need to be conceptualizing how our community colleges are engaging overseas, both at sort of that organizational level, but also then really understanding at the country level the work that's being done by U.S. community colleges, because that's only going to increase. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation as much as I've enjoyed researching it and sharing it with you. This is an area of research with which I'll be engaged for quite some time and would be happy to discuss it further with any one of you. I only wish I could be there in person to answer any questions and continue the discussion. That being said, I'm going to end today with a quote that for me really exemplifies the increasing importance of community colleges and their global counterparts in the worldwide higher education system. Thank you again. Take care.